All right, we are down to agenda item number 10. This is our stormwater rate adjustment discussion. Take us away, Ed.
All right, good afternoon, morning, evening, whatever time it is right now. So thank you, Mayor, Vice Mayor, Council, for having us here today. Ed Shank, Stormwater Manager for City Flagstaff, and we also have our rate consultant here with us, as well as many others. Sanjay, who will be presenting part of this from Water Resources Economics. And this is very timely, obviously. You've seen me up here quite a bit over the last 2 years for flood events, both museum fire and pipeline fire related. And unfortunately, today is the more serious conversation talking about the financial situation of stormwater. Also very timely with climate action and neutrality that went right before us, as we are also talking about the resiliency of our community, as well as addressing some of the impacts of the climate that we see in northern Arizona. So the extreme drought, obviously the fires, and now unfortunately the floods. So a quick overview on this. We'll present the results of the 2022 stormwater rate assessment that is in your packet. Some of the discussion points, we'll talk briefly about the stormwater program, its history, how we got to where we are today, the purpose of this rate adjustment, the rate basis and the policy recommendations, a timeline for this rate adjustment, and then obviously we're here for your feedback. So that's the meat and potatoes, if you will, of our presentation today. A rather busy slide here, but I do like this slide. This shows the evolution of our stormwater utility. So we were created as a utility in 2003. We were the first stormwater utility in the state of Arizona. At the moment, there's 7 stormwater utilities in the state of Arizona. There's over 2,500 stormwater utilities throughout the United States. Most of them were created in the 80s, 90s, and then accelerated quite quickly after that as flooding concerns became much more pronounced throughout the entire nation. Unfortunately, we're not alone in that. When we were created in 2003, it was recommended by the Stormwater Advisory Council that the rate would be $1.88 per ERU. It was set at 53 cents with the capital program going back to engineering. So we were a rather small section. We were mostly focused on FEMA floodplain management, so the regulatory component of the special flood hazard area and the National Flood Insurance Program. And with that was the development review, construction inspections, a very modest maintenance funding, and then the water quality and MS4 component. So we were housed under community development at that time. Very quickly in 2005, they determined that rate was insufficient. So there was a new rate study and a new rate that went into place, as well as a new credit manual. With this, we took over our own capital improvement program and the drainage investigations that would be required under that capital improvement program. 2007, we took over some of the master planning. So that's one of the Northeast Area Master Drainage Study, NEMADs. You're going to hear about that a few times today. It took 3 years, started in 2007 and was completed in 2010. Master planning is a critical component, obviously, with everything that we do for capital improvement programs as well as for maintenance. So that was the beginning of our master planning within stormwater. 2009 is when we took over that LID ordinance. That's when that was passed. The low impact development, green infrastructure, if you will, ordinance was passed and was put under the stormwater program. And also when we started really staffing up the alert network. This is that flood alert network that you get those rave alerts through the county unfortunately, all those flash floods that we've experienced over the last several years, especially this last 2 years. 2009 is when we started creating that ourselves. As you may know, we are actually over 24 net systems currently within the city. Between the city and county, we're over 50 now, mostly unfortunately due to the fires. 2012, and speaking of fires, 2012 is when the FWPP passed. Mostly unrelated to stormwater, but it did mean that we got much more involved with the regional watershed management, both with the county, with Forest Service, as well as within our own fire department. 2018 is when that Rio Flag flood control project really got the green light to move forward, and that's when we did our most recent stormwater rate adjustment to allow for some of the debt financing for that Rio to Flag project, for the Army Corps project. So for over $30 million worth of debt financing. Now, as you know, 2019, that's when we had the museum fire, some very large impacts there in terms of post-fire flood response that we needed to jump into, much more of the maintenance operations. We took that over from Public Works, and then all the asset management and GIS that's required to go into everything that we're talking about today. There's quite a bit in the backside that's that you really don't see in these slides, but there's quite a bit that we do in terms of GIS, mapping, asset management to actually understand what we're working with. And then obviously 2021, we had 4 very large flood events within the museum fire, as well as several flood events that were predicted by that NEMAD study. So that Prius video that we always talk about, that was actually in Fanning Wash. That was actually a predicted drainage deficiency predicted back in 2010. So it was unrelated to the fires. And then obviously this year with the pipeline fire. Similar slide, this just kind of shows the complexity of the stormwater utility here in Flagstaff. We're not unique. There are many stormwater utilities out there that have a very complex level of service developed for them. But we are, I'd say, on the side of a bell curve, if you will, that we are much more complex than many where it's divvied out to other engineering, capital improvement programs, public works, et cetera. To give some perspective before we go into the rate assessment of where we stand. So this is a really great study. I recommend reading it. It's free online. Campbell and Bradshaw 2021 is produced by Western Kentucky University, and it provided a survey of all stormwater utilities that they could find. At the time, it was about 2,200 stormwater utilities. And it looked at a variety of different things, their level of service and also their costs. So really what we're going to focus on today, obviously, is cost. We're talking about the rate adjustment. And this map here shows the rates per ERU, so per equivalent rate unit, which we're going to talk about today, for the entire United States as of last year, 2021. And as you can see, for Flagstaff, we are this small little bubble here at $3.74 per ERU. Obviously, there's lots of other stormwater utilities that are in that range, and then there's lots of these stormwater utilities that are either smaller or much, much larger. And we'll show a slide about that later as we get into our potential rate adjustments. Okay, so why are we here today? What's the reason for this rate adjustment? Obviously, we have that increase in level of service expected due to the fire and then now our flood events that impact both West Flagstaff as well as East Flagstaff, which has made both our capital improvement list go up substantially in terms of infrastructure that we need to upsize, as well as our operation and maintenance expectations. So that's both in terms of staffing, equipment, and then also the maintenance of this new infrastructure that we're building, most notably the detention basins. So the Killup School Detention Basin, the Schultz Creek Detention Basin, which just this week we got substantial completion on, the Parkway basins, which are planned with the county to be built, Francis Short Pond as a basin. That's not how we'd like to see it, but that's how it functions. And then others. So we've put Shadow Mountain online and other basins. So there's quite a bit in terms of O&M that goes into keeping these basins operational so that we can reduce the flood risk. As well as part of this rate assessment is just the ongoing cost of doing the business even before these fires. So we have obviously the Rio to Flag flood control project, as well as our typical capital improvement projects that we knew of before this series of events, as well as our spot improvements, so areas where you see that there's deficiencies either through longevity, so that the areas just failed due to being old, or new deficiencies due to change of roadway design or whatnot, where we have to go in and prevent repetitive flooding at a local level. So we're not talking a huge watershed. We're talking where 10 homes may flood just because they're in a low point, and we need to go in there and change out the catch basins or change out the piping. So again, our current rates at the moment at $3.74 per ERU. We have relatively limited capital funding. It's roughly $600,000 a year. In the past, that would fund between half and one project a year, depending on which type of project, sometimes even less. With our change in inflation, that's obviously been impacted. And then we also have, under the current rates, only a certain amount of O&M, operation and maintenance budget, for temporary flood mitigation, flood response, as well as just our typical maintenance. So some of this is currently unfunded. Flood response in particular is currently unfunded. So at the moment, we have a level of service which is, it's hard to meet, if you will, due to the budget that we have here. Under these proposed rates that Sanjay is going to go into shortly, we'll be increasing that capital funding to provide for more permanent flood mitigation. We're going to talk about two different scenarios. One, if that Proposition 441 passes, and one if Proposition 441 does not pass. Because obviously we have a certain level of need, and then just how we address that need in terms of funding. So part of it could go to bonds, part of it could go to rates. That discussion will come up. And then obviously we have that increased operating costs, the pre-season flood mitigation. As you've heard from Lucinda and the county, they are backing out on any additional help with sandbags and barriers. This year they provided 1.1 million sandbags to the city for both museum and a pipeline. At a cost of roughly $3 per sandbags, that was a benefit to the city of between $3 and $3.5 million that we will not receive next year. Detention basin maintenance, something else that's going to cost us quite a bit when those fill with sediment, fill with water, or have erosion, scour that need to be cleaned out. Fairly substantial cost. We're trying to keep that in line as best as possible. Staffing and equipment, and then continued master planning. It's really cost quite a bit to continue to do the planning that was required both by FEMA as well as by our code to make sure that we are maintaining the community at the level that we expect. So with these proposed rates, we can do all of this, and we can provide a sustainable budget for both the capital as well as the O&M. You've seen this slide before. This is the table for the capital side of our costs, our 7-year horizon. So we kind of grouped it between the Rio Flag Flood Control Project with the Army Corps, those spot improvements, which is fairly minimal. You can see it's roughly $80,000 a year, so we can do like 1 or 2 small projects a year. And then a museum and pipeline should be combined here. This is an older table. So the post-fire between those two, the NEMADs, and then future projects. So between museum and pipeline, that is the majority, not majority, I should take that back, half of the cost of our capital projects for the next 7 years. To show that geographic distribution, this just shows dots of approximate locations for some of those projects that are listed in that table, or shown in that table, not listed. So you can see sort of that pink color is museum fire related, the Spruce Wash. The yellow is related more to pipeline fire along Schultz Pass. The green is a scattering of both NEMADs and previously identified capital projects. And then this sort of olive color is that Rio Flag flood control project. So we do have it geographically distributed. Every neighborhood, or every section of town, I shouldn't say neighborhood, every section of the city will see some benefits from the capital improvements over the next 7 years. So stormwater rate basis, as I mentioned, it's the ERU basis, equivalent rate unit, and that is based on 1,500 square feet of impervious surface, which is a pretty equitable rate, or not rate, pretty equitable unit. The larger the unit that you decide to charge to, the more that you're putting on the residential community. The smaller that you're putting it on, the more you're putting on the commercial. So at 1,500 square feet, we are divvying it up pretty close to equal between the commercial and government side as well as the residential side. At the moment, we charge residential properties a maximum of 5 ERUs. The average residential property is at 3 ERUs. The median residential property is at 2 ERUs. Commercial properties do not have a maximum currently. One proposal that we have under this rate adjustment is to change the maximum for the residential, so taking it from 5 ERUs up to a cap of 10, and that would provide a little bit more of the funding from the residential side instead of the commercial, business, and government side. Mostly from those very large property or estates. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sanjay for a little more discussion on the rate model.
Good evening. Thank you, Ed. Mayor, City Council staff, I'd like to do in public, I'd like to do the next part of the presentation to talk about the financial plan. The financial plan was developed by staff, of course with my assistant, but with staff, and we also talked with the Water Commission. Also, we presented some of these information to you before. One, as Ed mentioned, one of the biggest increase is operating costs with level of service associated with detention basins. That's a significant cost. Because of that, we will need to increase the operating budget. There are additional costs associated with it, but roughly $2.2 million associated with that. Significant capital expenditure, as Ed has mentioned, over the next 7 years. That'll be $12.7 million that's needed. In order to fund all these different projects, we've developed a mixture of different sources of revenues, whether it's revenue bonds, whether it's GEO bonds, which we hope to get approved, grants, and then rate revenue, which is cash basis. We're hoping that the November GEO bond does get approved, but if it doesn't, we have a plan associated with that. And if those the GEO bonds does not get approved by the voters, then it would have to be funded by the ratepayers through the stormwater fee. And I'll be presenting both scenarios. So the top table shows the operating costs. We have what we would call the sort of the traditional operating costs, and then the next one is the additional O&M, that operating cost that's needed for personnel, capital, pre-season, flood mitigation, and as I mentioned, the detention basin. As you can see, those costs are significant, and they are increasing because of all the different challenges that we're facing associated with the fire and the flooding. The bottom graph now shows the funding mixture associated with the capital project. Ed showed the 7-year horizon of expenditures. This shows how we're funding it and the mixtures of different rate revenues, revenue bonds, grant funded, and the GEO bonds that we're hoping for. Now, one thing you notice is that the grant funded only shows through 2024, because that's what we're anticipating will occur. Now, we are hoping, we will be, staff, I know staff are diligent about looking for more grant funded. So if we get those sources of revenues, that means future rate increases wouldn't be as needed. But we can't count on that right now. We can't assume that we're going to get it. But we will try our best. I know staff is very diligent about that. So this chart here is the financial picture of the agency. Right over here is the reserve target that we would like to have. And this reserve target is to meet operating costs, to meet and also some emergencies that may occur in the future. Then what we have over here are the bars, which are the revenues coming in. And this darker color here, brown color, is associated with the GEO bonds and the revenues coming in for that to pay for those projects. The background now are all the different costs that are coming in. We have the operating costs, we have current debt, we have proposed debt, and we have the CIP projects. Because those projects are so substantial and so much, what happens is that the ending balance gets drawn down on. And as you notice, it's a negative slope, which is not good from a financial picture. So we're drawing on this reserve, and then by 2026, as you can see, it's negative. Yes?
Real quick, Councilmember Aslan has a question.
Yeah, thank you. Why do grants taper off after 2024?
Because that's what we know for sure we'll receive. We're hoping to get some more, but in this financial plan, we're assuming we don't have any. Now, if we do get them, that means that in the future we don't have to do as much. But we know we will have grants for 2024. So as seen, the current revenues are not sufficient to pay for the increased operating costs, the flood mitigation response, and future capital expenditure. Significant rate increases will be needed to meet the stormwater obligation. And as I mentioned, we're going to be looking at 2 scenarios. The first is the GEO bond, if approved in this November. Then some of the capital projects will be funded through property tax. Or in the second one is where the GEO bond is not approved, and then all these projects will have to be funded through the stormwater fee. Excuse me. So these are now the proposed fees. These are the 2 scenarios. This is the GEO bond approved, and this is not the GEO bond approved. This is the current fee per ERU, which is $3.74. As you can see, there is a big jump here, and this is to deal with all the increase in operating costs, as I mentioned, all the capital projects that we need to do. A lot of these projects are front-loaded. This is the challenge that we're facing, is that we've had these fires, we've had all these situations, and now we have to react to it and absorb it. If we could delay projects, I know that that's not possible, but if we could, then we could smooth things out a little bit, but that's the challenge that we're facing. As you can see, these are the increases. They are more substantial in the front years, and then the out years are much more minor. These are the dollar increases over here, so you can see the changes in dollars. So you can see that, as I mentioned, in the out years, then it goes up by 36 cents approximately each year. But in the first 3 years or so is when you see the most substantial increases. By doing this, and this is the one where the voters approved the GO bonds, what happens now is these bars now are much more bigger. Everything else, the costs are the same, so these bars are bigger now. Then you see this line here now, and this is the ending balance, and as you can see, it's always above the red. And then by 2024, we're slightly above. And so the goal here is to be above it, and also, when we award contracts, we need to have the money in the bank to award these projects, so we need to have this money to be able to do these large projects. This is now, if the GO bond's not approved, then a bit more substantial increases are needed, as I shown before. So these bars are a little bit higher. You don't see the GO bonds now, that brown color anymore, and then this is the ending balance, as you see. And again, similar picture, but what we're trying to do is make sure we have enough money to pay for these large projects to be able to be executed, and then eventually get to a steady state where we're slightly above the ending balance. Of course, impacts to customers is one of the most important factors besides level of service and maintaining this level is, well, what does this cost to our customers? What we have here is our current 3 ERU charge. That's the typical residential. As Ed mentioned, that's $11.22 per month. With the proposed, with scenario 1, where the GO bonds do get approved, then it'll be $19.64. Scenario 2, if the GO bonds do not get approved, then it'll be $25.25. You see the monthly change here and the annual change here too. We also looked at this on the commercial side, both for the big box and for the average restaurant. The big box typically has 220 ERUs. So as you can see, their monthly cost is $822. That will go up with scenario 1 with $1,439 and some change, and scenario 2 will be $1,851. And then you can see the monthly charge, annual charge. For restaurants, typically most restaurants have 14 ERUs. That's $52.36. With the proposed scenario 1 will be $91.63. Without the GO bonds, it'll be $117.81. So we've talked about the financial obligations or the challenges of stormwater. We've talked about what this means to our customers. It's also good to take a step back and ask ourselves, what does this mean nationally in United States with stormwater? Ed talked about all the different stormwater utilities out here. And here's a chart that has that information. As mentioned, each agency is slightly different. It is a bit of apples, oranges, pineapples, and mangoes in the sense that they all have different levels of services. They're dealing with different things. Some are dealing with water quality issues with the salmon. Some are not. Some are dealing with floods like you are. But you have the different costs here. Here's the current one. And then we normalized it to 1,000 square footage. That's the sort of the standard, but we normalized it for that. Then over here you see scenario 1, this is with the GO bonds being approved, and scenario 2 with the GO bonds not being approved. As you can see, you're one of the lowest currently. In this survey and all the different nuances as we mentioned, you'd be more in the middle of the pack or a little bit in the higher tiers. I suspect all these different agencies are also doing stormwater fees, and so that you'll see a little bit of a shift there that's occurring over time. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Ed to talk about the rate implementation schedule.
Thank you, Sanjay. So this slide gets nice. I like this slide because it gets shorter each time. As we continue to check things off, we get to make the table smaller. So obviously we're here today with this work session for the discussion. Tomorrow we'll put out that newspaper notice. There already has been one out. This will be the next notice for the public notice for the intent to make a rate adjustment. And then November 15th would be that first public hearing. November 29th would be the second read of the ordinance. And then if approved, it will be January 1st that the rate would be effective. So start of the year. So moving fast and furious on this, mostly because we have to. I'm just gonna be honest. It's a lot of work to move this quickly, but it's needed, unfortunately, just due to the amount of financial backlog that we have within the stormwater section. So I mentioned some of this already in terms of community outreach. We will have that public hearing notice in the newspaper going out tomorrow. We do have a website, and I believe that's the next slide, that has, I hope it is, that has the rate adjustment on there, as well as some of the previous handouts and some of these talking points. There will be a virtual open house on, I really hope that we have this is the right slide deck. Might have to. Do have a virtual open house on October 26th at noon. It is the next slide? Okay. Oh, it's just not on this. Yeah, unfortunately, I put the wrong slide deck up here. So that's tomorrow. Tomorrow at noon, we do a virtual community forum on Teams. November 10th at 4 p.m. in person, we have a city council here in Chambers, as well as on Teams. November 14th at 6 p.m. Virtually on Microsoft Teams. And then we do have road shows going out. So we did talk to the Chamber of Commerce. We'll be talking to NEU and are open, obviously. We sent it out to a lot of different groups. Those were the two that got back to us so far.
Seacrest, we just put Seacrest School on November 7th at 6 p.m. for a public meeting, in-person public hybrid meeting.
Okay, so Seacrest School as well as a hybrid meeting. Yeah, Lisa can help me with some of that as well. I apologize. We have a really great slide here, but it's just not the slide